Hi, I'm Steve Moriarty from Moriarty's Gem Art. We're located on the square in Crown Point, and we're also online as MoreGems.com, where we have a wide selection of opal. Today we're cutting this very unusual opal. This is a top crystal opal, very clear crystal. That's all it means, is high transparency. This comes from Wilo, Ethiopia. This is material that we have cut before, but much of it has been totally unsuccessful. This type of opal typically crazes after you cut it. The whole surface will craze up, and even if you cut through that, it's going to keep crazing. This particular piece, my supplier, who's been a long-time supplier, guarantees me that this one won't craze. Hopefully he knows what he's talking about, because we're going to give this a shot today. It's a 120 carat piece of crystal opal. It is not hydrophane. Hydrophane, if you lick your finger and stick it to it, you can feel that it's sticky. This one's not sticky at all, so I doubt it has any of the hydrophane character that most of the opals from Wilo, Ethiopia have. So today I'm going to cut this into two pieces. It's kind of an odd shape, so I'm going to try and get an oval out of this and a pear shape possibly out of this end. I'm going to do a little more complex cut on it, kind of a two slice cut. And when you're cutting these, you do have to be careful, because the shape of the saw blade being round, when you're cutting here, when you get to this point where you want to quit, it's already cut 2/3 of the way through the back of it. So I'm going to take this opal and we're going to tilt it a little bit and try and compensate for that and get two pieces out of this. So this is our 120 carat crystal opal, and I've kind of marked out what we're going to do with it. So we've got an oval over here, and these lines here are kind of where I think the girdle's going to end up once I cut into it. I marked that out, then I measured to where I felt the center was, and then measured across to this side, and that's where I'm going to cut. Now, normally you would just cut straight through it, but if I did that, it would affect the size of this stone, this pear shape, so I want to get the tip over here. So I'm going to try and cut this direction and straight up this direction about halfway through it, and hopefully it'll give us a little more yield out of this piece. I've marked where I want to end my saw cuts, because I'm going to do two saw cuts, one from each direction. And hopefully it'll work, and we'll get a better yield out of this piece. So today I'll be using this high-tech diamond saw. This is a diamond saw blade. We're using water, although we don't think this is hydrophane. In a hydrophane opal, using oil, it'll absorb the oil and damage the opal. So we're using water today, which I generally use water on most things, as the coolant. So I'm going to tilt it a little bit to take, because the lower end of this blade is cutting deeper. So I'm going to try and hit the middle of this and just to get the best yield out of it. That's halfway through. All right. So here's what we have now. Happened to my light. So this will be our oval. This is the crown of the stone, mainly because this angle on this side is shaped kind of like the pavilion. We got a nice low crown on this. These opals, you can pretty much cut them however you want, as long as you cut the pavilion right. I cut it at 45 degrees typically. The crown, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Doesn't seem to have a whole lot of effect on the beauty of the stone. So this will be an oval. This currently, the weight is about 75 carats, so maybe a 40 carat. And this likely a pear shape. This was the other option to go on the saw cut, but I think we're going to do a pear shape for best yield on this one. And this weighs 42 carats, so maybe if we're lucky we'll get a 25 carat out of it. So next step is to dop it up. Then we'll preform it, and I think we're going to let it set a couple of days, because sometimes it takes a couple of days to see whether they do craze. And you don't want to put all your effort into it before you know whether it's going to be a problem or not. So we are going to facet both these pieces. The advantage of faceting is that the facets actually add some color to the opal. As clear as this material is, I'm not sure if it's going to work with this, but other Wheelo opals, you do get a red flash off the back facets when you fasten them. So it is a benefit to faceting, and it gives you a unique look and some brilliance in something this clear. So today we're going to I'm going to preform these, cut the surface off, and then I'm going to let them set for a couple of days just to see if they do end up crazing or not. Even though I'm guaranteed they won't craze, I'm not sure personally that that's going to happen. So we'll take the surface off, let them set, then they should craze within a few days if they are going to do that. One thing I've found on these Wheelo opals is you do not want to put too much pressure on them. You can cause cracking when you do that. You can be a firm touch, but just not heavy pressure. So that's pretty much got the surface off of this. So I think that will tell us whether it's going to craze or not. and then after a couple days we'll dop it up and start faceting. So that's our pear shape. This wheel is probably about a 180 grit. And that's probably as far as I need to go on this oval. And again, after a couple days, we'll dop it up and start faceting. It's been over 2 days now, and fortunately, our preforms, no cracks have formed in it. So with any luck, these are stable. And we're going to start cutting now. And we're going to first cut the larger piece. This is going to be oval or round. And this particular one, I don't remember the weight on it, but should cut somewhere around 22 millimeters. So in order to get this dopped up, the first thing that I do is try and find the center of the stone. And one way to do that with this piece of rough is to take a millimeter gauge, and these will mark on the stone. So I'll go well past halfway across and put a mark, and then do the same for the opposite and put a mark on it, and do this direction also. So you get a little square box that will show you kind of where the center of the stone is. Now this stone we have to do a little compensating because of the shape. You know, this is our table, and because this angle is much shallower than this angle, and also this end the same way, this angle is close to our cutting angle, but I'm going to compensate by dopping this a little towards the deep end on this side and also towards the deep end on this side, and that'll get it so we cut into these shallower ends and kind of move the center of the stone over. And I'll just use this box to center the dop on it, and instead of hitting in the center, I'm going to move it away from the shallow end in both directions, and so hopefully that'll get us, it's going to get us a little more, that our culet's going to be over here where it's a little deeper. Hopefully that makes sense. So I've got some sticky, this is dental wax on this dop, and it'll create an impression of the stone when I get it centered, and hold the stone in place while I glue it. Not the easiest to see these lines. And then try and see that the dop is set on there flat. And this is really a very critical stage for your final yield on your stone. So you do want to make sure you get it right. And you can double check with the millimeter gauge. Kind of. All right, I think that's where I want it to be. This is 5-minute epoxy. So my dop's in place, so I won't be gluing beneath the dop, between the dop and the stone. This is for easy removal later. It's not quite as good of attachment as it would be if you had dop between the stone and or glue between the stone and the dop. But it will pop off much easier, and I don't have to use heat in the end is the purpose. And if you get enough glue on it and get it attached well enough, I rarely have a problem with the dop coming off. Usually I wait a little while and let this set up just a little bit. Just give it a minute or so, otherwise the glue is going to spread across the stone. Kind of work it into the stone and into the dop so you get a good attachment. And then just kind of invert it and invert it again, just to keep it from spreading outside where you're going to cut. You don't want to be cutting into glue. That will break the seal. You don't want it running all the way down the dop into the dopping device, so you can't get it loose. But so then,
oh, that's beautiful. That is beautiful.
just keep doing this until it starts to solidify. And once it's set up, you need to let it set for at least 6 hours. Better off that you wait till tomorrow. Make sure you get a good seal. And that's pretty much it for the dopping process. The next stone will be this, which looks like a pear shape. And we'll hope for the best that they don't craze. We'll see in another few days when we're done cutting. Well, our opal is dopped up now, and it's been dopped up for several days and still no cracks in it. So this top crystal opal, this could be one of the first pieces we've ever cut that doesn't crack. We're not sure of that yet, but hopefully so. So when we dop this, because of the shape of the stone with much greater depth on this end and this end, we kind of dopped it off center. So we dopped it closer to the deep ends. So when we're cutting, we'll cut a little further in on the shallow ends, because this stone really doesn't have enough depth to get the full size of the piece. So how we dopped it should give us maximum yield. It is fairly low, so there's not room for multiple sets of facets on the bottom. The pavilion of the stone could be just 1 row or 2 rows of facets on the pavilion. So the first thing we're going to do is try and decide whether this is actually an oval or is it a round, and we're going to do that by forming our girdle first. So we put this to 90 degrees. And you can see this side actually is touching the lap because we dopped it off center. This side is not touching the lap yet. So we're going to want to cut a facet on the side that is currently not touching, because we have to go at least that deep. So we'll just cut that a little bit and then go around to the other side and cut as deep as necessary to get them equal. Because we only have 16 millimeters of depth, and this piece was about 28 millimeters wide, we can't get 28 millimeters. So we do have to cut it smaller. We're probably going to be down to maybe 22 millimeters. And we're cutting the shallow side of it off. If you look at the stone, the center is about here, and we're going to cut more of the shallow end off just to try and get maximum yield out of this piece. So we're still at about 25 millimeters, and I know it's going to have to be smaller than that. So now we've got the two sides are about equal. I do need to cut a little deeper into the deeper side, to get a facet there. And then match the opposite. So then do the same to the other ends of the stone. Try not to hit the edge of the lap. So now we can look at it and try and determine a shape to make this. Decide whether we've got enough material for a crown as we are, which it kind of looks like we do. So these two ends are cut deeper because they are much shallower, and we move the rough this way. So currently our length to width, so we've got about 28 millimeters long and 24 wide. So probably the next thing I'm going to want to do is cut maybe a Girdle Facet to see whether we have to cut deeper to get the angle we need, which is about 45 degrees. So I'm going to try and cut this facet and see if 45 degrees will still give us enough crown as it is. If not, we'll have to cut the stone thinner. It's going to be either an oval or a cushion is the likely shape. So I'm going to do some test facets here to try and determine whether my width needs to be cut back a little more, just because of the shallow depth of the stone. So the angle of 45 degrees that I want to cut the pavilion at, we want to see how far it's going to cut into this girdle to get it to the center. You don't have to go all the way to the center, but we'll try and decide just how wide the stone can be. So this is raising the mast, get it to the point where it's just cutting. And as we can see, it's cutting down here. There's a little section there it started. So I need to get that facet up close to here and still have some girdle left and some crown height. So we may well have to cut the stone a little thinner to make this work. So you can see where we've moved to. So as it's cutting up this direction, it's also cutting down here. And this section here, we need to have enough girdle or enough crown height, which will have a girdle here, and then the material below here will be for the crown. And we're probably going to have to make it thinner because it's more than enough crown right now, but we've got a ways to go to hit the center here. So I lower the mast to get closer into the lap. And I actually can go to the other side now, and there'll be a lot of material I have to remove on this side. So here we can just go and cut to 0 because we have to remove the same amount as was removed on the other side. So we've still got this area across here that we still have to go to meet. So we're going to take the mast height down a little more. And this you want to check off, and while you're doing the first cut, once you've determined how far you're going to cut on this facet, when you think you're close to the center, then you can go to the other side. You really don't have to look then. What you remove here, you have to do on the other side. So we still have a ways to go. This material here still has to be removed. And this side continues to get thinner. So once it gets too thin, maybe down to here, we're going to have to take the width in more, which I'm assuming I'll have to, because this is 25 millimeters. And only 16 millimeters deep. You got to figure this cut's going to be at least 75% depth. So 75 of 20 millimeters is 15, so we're not going to get much wider than 20 millimeters. So this is going to have to come in probably another 4 or 5 millimeters yet, the width of it. So we're getting close, still a little ways to go. That's probably close enough to, what we're going to try and do now is determine what kind of cut we're going to do. And as you can see here, there's a little bit short on the crown height, although the crown is actually, the material is somewhere down here. The material kind of cuts back to a deeper portion of the stone, and we're going to want to cut this in deeper. Then we'll look at it and try and determine just what shape we're going to cut. So back to 90 degrees. Because this stone has a longer length, we're probably going to be oval or cushion. So right now we don't really need to cut this to determine what we're going to cut. We may want to do a little work down here. Just to see what kind of girdle, whether we need to cut this side in also. But let's work on the 48 and the 96 index first, get that right. So that was a time lapse of cutting the ends of the stone on 24 and 72 to try and determine where our culet's going to be. So now that we've got that close, now we can look at the girdle and cut where I think the girdle facet should be. And we're going to start with the low points, which would be on this side, and then we've got a low point here. So that's where you're going to want to start. We've got plenty of material down here and really not quite enough material for a crown here. But let's start where we have the greatest problem, and that's on this section here. So we'll put facets there, and then we'll match them around the stone. So we're just trying to create the girdle now, and creating the girdle so I know there's enough material for a crown or close to it. You can change that later also. And once we've done that, we'll look at it and decide what we're going to cut out of it. So back to 90 degrees. We're on the 96 index. Now here's a point that I could determine that I'm going to have to cut more over here, so I may not use 96 as this girdle facet. I may go to 1 to either side, or in this case I'm going to try 3 to either side of the 96, which is going to be 93 and 3. When I do my notes, I'm just generally, this would be plus and minus 3, which would be 93 and 3 is how I notate. So I'm going to cut 3 to either side of 96 and make a girdle facet. So we take it down till it just starts touching the girdle. Turn the water on. Take a quick look. Gonna have to go a lot more. Cut the other side. I say once you've committed to cutting one side, you just go ahead and cut the other to exactly that same depth. Don't have to look at it much. As long as it's a symmetrical stone, each of those facets is going to be cut to the same depth. And then you can also go to the other side and cut 3 to either side of the 48, which would be 45 and 51. So now those sides are cut the same. Whether they're cut deep enough or not is yet to be determined. So once I've done that, our next issue is this corner here. So I'm gonna maybe go out to 6 or 9 to either side. Or just look at it and determine kind of where the flat is, and in this case it is on 9. 6, 9. Looks like one will cut an even facet there. And I'm almost there, so I don't want to overcut it. So now the concern is, if this is the girdle, does a girdle go straight across here? And I'm not quite sure it does yet between those two facets. So, but now that I've cut that one, I'll go ahead and match everything all the way around the stone. And at this point, there's no reason to look, just cut to 0. I'm cutting a symmetrical stone, so once you've cut away one side, you just know you're going to cut to the same point on every other side. The less you look at it while you're cutting, the quicker you're going to be. So if you look down on it, you can kind of see our outline now. We'll put more facets in, so it's either going to be oval or cushion. Now back to, this is still our current issue, whether I need to cut in further. Because I don't have a real good straight girdle line here. It's close. So a couple things you could do. I could change this one to 4 or this one to 8. and that'll bring this issue right here, which is the straight girdle line we need. It would cut that in more at the middle and give us more girdle at this point that is very thin. So I'm going to take a few minutes and take a look at that and before I move forward. So I've decided that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to change the +3 index, or 93, to 92. So I'm going to be plus and minus 4 from 96. So I'll cut that until I've cut away the facet that we'd cut on 3, or close to it, because I'm also going to put a facet now at 0, either that or plus and minus 1. So I'll cut both sides the same on plus and minus 4. So these are on 48 and 52. And then the facet that was 9, I'm going to change to 8. Which will be 88 and 8 on the 96 side. And on the 48 index side, this will be 56 and 40. And hopefully that'll be enough to give us a girdle line, a straight girdle line across the stone. If not, I'll have to do some more cutting, but looks good so far. And I'm also going to put a facet on 0 and decide whether to do plus and minus 1, depending on how many facets you want on this. And I think I'll do plus and minus 1. Or 1 and 95. This is always the most difficult and most important part of cutting your stone, because what you do now really determines what your yield's going to end up. So the ends of this stone are pretty flat, so I'm just going to either cut it flat or you put a few facets on the end just as a starter, and I'm going to do plus and minus 1 from the ends, which 24, so it'll be 25 and 23. So now I have to determine whether I have girdle facets that will produce a straight line around the stone, which is not necessarily easy. Kind of a rough way of doing it, but better than naked eye. And it looks like it may produce a straight girdle line. So this gives me the minimum amount of facets that I need to produce a stone. Do I want to put more in, or just what am I going to do with this cut? It's kind of an antique cushion now. Do I want to put some facets in the corner? Because I'm really kind of short on facets on the ends, so I'll have to look at it and determine just what I want to do and decide how I'm going to cut that, because this is mostly going to be a brilliant. My experience with these opals is that even if you have just one row of brilliant facets, it tends to work. In other opals that are crystal, those facets have reflected almost a reddish orange color and have given a lot of color to the stone that wasn't really there. It wasn't play of color, but it was just reflecting the body color of the stone. But this stone is so clear that I don't know if that effect is going to happen with this or not. So I'm going to put the minimum amount of facets. I haven't found that opals become extremely brilliant. That more facets is going to help significantly. So I'm going to put kind of a minimum amount on the pavilion, and then try and break up the crown a little bit with more step facets. So take a look at this and get back with you as soon as I decide what the heck to do with this. Because of the large size of the facet that was on plus and minus 8 and the large size of the facets on the end, I am going to put some corner facets in. So these will be on 12, 84, 60, and 36. So this is now the shape that we're going to deal with, and I'll have to decide just how to deal with this. It's possible I'll do a Berrien style, which can be done for pretty much any shape. It's a brilliant style. that should work with this girdle outline. So our girdle facets are in. Now we're going to try and produce some type of brilliant cut in this kind of cushiony oval shape. I don't have much room to put more than a single row of facets in. I'm going to try and just basically make the girdle outline smooth and get some brilliance from the back, and hopefully with the crown cut as a 2 or 3 step cut, we'll get a little brilliance to this piece. We're mainly after getting the colors that are in the stone to reflect through the stone and maybe add some of that red that you typically get in a faceted opal. So I'm going to try and cut 1 to either side again, and we're going to be about 46 degrees to get this to close up, and then we'll try and get the next set of facets to create a nice even girdle and be reflective for a nice interesting opal. And having never cut this, I'm not sure what we're going to get out of it, but hopefully something pretty. So we're cutting on a New Bond 325. Unfortunately, they are no longer manufactured. But I like these because often I can go straight to polish from cutting with this lap. This is a very large facet, so it does take quite some time to cut facets this size. So this facet I'm cutting at right at 46 degrees because this is 1 to either side of the 96, and the next row of facets I'll have to cut lower so it'll cut to a point. So I'll be averaging probably somewhere around 45 degrees in the next 2 or 3 facets. Okay, so I've got the 4 facets cut and pre-polished. They were big facets, so they took a lot of work. So now I'm going to put in another facet and try and have it meet up here at the cullet. We're going to move to 4 to either side, which will be 44 and 52. And I'll try and get that facet to meet the girdle and meet at the cullet. So I'll have to lower the angle a little bit. I was at 46. So now we're probably going to drop a half a degree or so. It looks like may have to drop a little more than that. So this is somewhat of an unconventional cut. You'll see that facets like this one over here do not exactly close up way we would normally do in a brilliant, but it's kind of a different type of material. We're just trying to create mirrors that hopefully play a color that's in this, which is not intense, but spread across the entire stone, and hopefully we'll get a mirrored effect that's going to show that well. I haven't really done much of this as far as this type of material, so each time you do something new, it is new and it's an experiment, so we'll find out later whether this type of cutting actually worked for this stone. It's cut, I have to pre-polish it, then we'll polish and move on to the crown. So I've pre-polished all the facets on this 325 lap. So I started on a 400 steel lap and went to this 325. This is a Raytec new bond lap, which unfortunately they don't make anymore because it's pretty amazing. I can go from a steel lap to this 325 and go direct to polish. Cuts out a lot of steps. Hopefully they reproduce this. I know somebody's working on it because I find it a great lap to use. Just cuts out a lot of steps. I have polished several of the facets on this. I have a few to go. And I'm polishing with a spectral lap. This is a 3M product. It's cerium oxide. And one thing I found with these is for a stone this size, it may take 2 or 3 of these actually to do the whole process. But after a while, after it slows down, I find that you can add a little cerium oxide to it, just a very small amount, and it will continue to polish and actually polish quicker than a new spectral lap. I recommend using the spectral lap. You can run much faster without the cerium, but you have to slow it down a lot when you put cerium on it and cut down the drip to a minimal amount. I'll show you that because this lap is pretty much worn out on its own, so I'm at the point that I'm adding cerium to it. So this is my notation for where the facets are on this. I pretty much do plus and minus of the indexes, like 96. These are plus and minus 1, plus and minus 4, plus and minus 8, plus and minus 12. And this is actually the ends, which would relate to the 74 and 24 index. And that's how I notate my facets. So I've done plus and minus 1. I've got to do plus and minus 4, which is at 45 degrees. So to use the extra cerium oxide, which the type I use is super cerium oxide. This comes from Kingsley North. So just got to cut down the drips to a minimal amount, otherwise it'll just wash the cerium right off. You do have to run a little slower. So just get your finger wet and get a little cerium. Just put it in the middle by the drip. Check to see where it's polishing. So it's polishing towards the girdle, so I've got to raise the mast. Just lower the angle just a little bit. So this is a pretty big facet. It runs the full length of this piece, and it's that quick to polish from the 325 Nubon lap with the Spectra lap. Takes a while to find the facet, but it does polish quite quickly. Such a long facet, it takes a lot of adjustment to get it to exactly where it needs to be. Just kind of walking it down the facet. And occasionally you need to recharge. Now, when you use this method, adding cerium oxide to it, I try to avoid cutting into the lap. It tends to scratch the facet next to it. So you want to stay with the rotation of the lap coming into the stone, not being on this side, because that can cause you problems. And keep the amount of cerium down to a minimum. All right, those two are done. Two more on the other side. I finished polishing the pavilion, and as you can see, I've glued it up using epoxy. I prefer epoxy just because the way I glue it, I can pick off the epoxy, and usually the dots come off without heating. As you can see or may not be able to see, I did not polish the girdle in this case. Polishing the girdle depends on whether it's obvious or not. And in this very light material, this girdle would be difficult to see that it's not polished. It's pre-polished. I do occasionally polish girdles. It takes some extra time. I'll polish girdles when the material is dark and the girdle is obvious, or when the girdle is quite thick and also obvious. Otherwise, I personally don't polish girdles. So once this glue is set up, a minimum of 6 hours, we'll get on the crown, and I'll probably do a step cut crown with this. It's going to be fairly low because we have a low point right here that's going to determine the angle we have to cut at. It's been probably 18 hours. The glue should be well set up. I've got a lot of glue on it, so it's going to take a little bit to remove it.
How much? 14. Is it? You got an idea what it was? Here. That's what it looks the difference. Yeah. Well, you can figure it. Get an idea.
Don't usually have quite this much glue on it, but big piece.
Or you just get that in?
Because I don't glue between the dop and the stone, we hope when we get the glue off it's just going to come loose. This is for heat sensitive stones, which this would be. Try not to get it too hot. Oop, that was easier than I expected. Came off a little more sudden than usual, but it looks like it's all okay. So this is our issue right here. Well, we've got a couple of low spots, so we've got to find out what angle we got to cut that at to get our first row of facets. I'm going to start at 50, and hopefully it works out at that angle. 148. So this is probably at plus 12.
See that seal film is right.
So we're trying to find an angle that'll get our first row of facets to create the girdle. Because of this big chip in it, it's going to determine what angle we're going to have to cut it at. And we're real close at 50. 50 is where I'd like to start, but we're going to have to lower it some. So can you get close on this, Mike? You see that little divot there? So that's the divot I'm trying to get out. So now the question is, could I go back to 50 or is 45 better? I could cut deeper at 50 and go back around and recut the girdle, because this is on the pavilion, it's a single row of facets, so I could go around and recut the whole girdle. So that's the decision I have to make, is whether to get a little steeper angle. Either way, I'm going to probably have to cut the girdle unless I lower the crown even more, and I hate to lower it much more. So we'll keep it at this and keep it at 45, see how far I've got to go. So it's out. I still have some girdle left. I'll have to decide whether I need more girdle than that. It's probably sufficient. If you get too thin of a girdle, of course, when the setter goes to set it, it gets to be a brittle spot. But the divot's out, and there should be enough material all the way around now to cut at this angle to set my girdle. So really where you generally want to start if you have no problems is the lowest point, which in this case would be what's closest to 96 because it's an oval. So at this location, this will be the lowest point that you're cutting. And if you're going to cut at a specific angle and then not change the mast height all the way around, you're going to have to start here. If you start over here, you'll be below 0 here on your gauge. So the starting point for us will be plus and minus 1 from 96, and we'll cut those at 45 and then continue around. I cut on 8 just to get rid of that problem area. Now I'll go back and recut everything, including the area that we had the problem. I've finished the first row, and that went remarkably well, and it was pretty quick. Our girdle is thin, but maybe not too thin. So I'm going to cut the table next. This row was at 45 degrees. I'll cut the table, of course, at 0. And then I'm going to put in a row of facets at 25, and then the middle row at 35 degrees. So again, when you're setting your first facet, you need to be cutting at the lowest point, which this case was plus or minus 1. Used to be when I first started cutting, I'd cut that row and then I'd re-zero to the next set, which was silly. So just cut this one at or near 0 and then just go around and match. Don't change the mast height at all. There'll be a little difference in the angles, but it won't make any difference, particularly if you do the same thing to all 3 rows. It's going to work out just fine. So when I cut the table, I always cut on 96 or the highest number that's available, just so I know where to go back to when I polish. So I hold the mast to 0 on my meter and just crank it down until it starts cutting. That's glue I'm cutting at the moment. You'll be able to hear the difference once you run your water too. Still cutting through the glue that was left from the dop. This machine does have a 45-degree adapter, but I don't find it works well, and anytime you have to remove the stone from the machine, you throw some variables in there that can create problems. And this 45 dot for this machine is really a useless piece of equipment. It just doesn't hold solidly into the machine. So much better if you can hold it straight up and down on 0 and just cut the table. Are you seeing the meter too, Mike? So we'll try that. There was a divot here in the table. There's some glue in it. We'll see if the first row of facets cuts that away and cuts it clean. Down here there's some glue from the dot from the other side. So we'll put the next row of facets, the table breaks, in at 25 degrees. I finished the crystal opal. I went with a simpler crown again. I was going to put 3 rows of step facets in, and I looked at it after 2 and thought, maybe that's good enough. Because my concern here is not so much brilliance, but getting some reflections of those broad bands of color that are in it, and whether more facets would have helped that. I'm not sure, but it looked good with 2 rows, so I stuck with 2 rows. Polished remarkably well. The entire crown, including the table, I got polished in about 32 minutes, which is pretty remarkable. Using these Spectralaps, I polished this entire stone on 1 Spectralap, and that's because of the cerium oxide. You know, after you wear it out somewhat, adding a little bit of the cerium oxide really does a remarkable job extending the life of the Spectralap and polishing much quicker. Whether you start out with cerium, it may be a good idea to start with cerium rather than polishing without the cerium to start with, because it is remarkably quick. So tomorrow we'll see what this crystal opal looks like. Don't see any issues with it so far, and by now I would think I would have seen some of the crazing in the opal. If it was like most of the opal that's this crystalline that comes from Ethiopia, they tend to within a day or so start cracking up. So hopefully we're lucky with this one, and I don't have to take the guarantee up of my Ethiopian dealer who said that this one will hold up, and looks like he might be right. So I'm Steve Moriarty from Moriarty's Gem Art here on the Square in Crown Point, Indiana, and online as MoreGems.com. I want to thank you for watching, and watch for more videos in the future.